It's time for Dialogue Conspiracy with political research specialist Mae Brussell, who for 3 years has shared with us her decades' research into political assassinations and abuses of power in this country. Her program relates the news of the week to emerging evidence about the conspiracy which allegedly maintains by force its control over the legislative and judicial processes in America. And now, here's Mae.
Good afternoon. This is Mae Brussell in Carmel, California, and the Dialogue Conspiracy number 206, July 21st, 1975. I heard on the radio coming down to the station that Gerald Ford has apologized to the family of Dr. Frank Olson for his death that related from an experiment between the Army and the Central Intelligence Agency. And the bulk of the program today is going to be about Dr. Frank Olson and the question, was it suicide when he jumped out the window or murder? I'm going to talk about CIA doctors that falsified medical evidence and diagnosis on the paper to justify maybe future brain examinations. And I'm going to talk about Chestnut Lodge because Dialogue Conspiracy number 200, that was 6 weeks ago on June 16th, I mentioned something which I very seldom bring up on this program, which is my own personal life. And I talked about the fact that my son was given what was allegedly LSD in 1967 when I was in New Orleans trying to help Jim Garrison with his case against Clay Shaw. And I have said for many years that I believe that the agent who gave him that family, were military connected to Navy intelligence or the Central Intelligence Agency. And at the time, on Dialogue Conspiracy number 200, I mentioned Chestnut Lodge as being the institution in Maryland where they were to ship my son, and I halted that. Luckily, he was almost sent there. It's a military CIA hospital. And the news this week came out that there were arrangements to send Dr. Frank Olson to the Chestnut Lodge in Maryland, the same CIA hospital that where my son was to be sent. And I'll talk about the similarities between Dr. Olson, my family, and another victim from Chicago, Illinois, who was incarcerated in Chestnut Lodge. This woman, her name is Judith Beckstein, and I'll talk about her and her office visit with her doctor there, Dr. Thompson, who was former or present chief of psychiatry at Bethesda Navy Hospital. And while she was at this institution, she heard a telephone conversation that convinced her that the Maryland police authorities and the doctors at Chestnut Lodge were linked to the past political assassinations, to the John Kennedy, Robert Kennedy, Martin Luther King assassinations. And in 1972, Arthur Bremer was and is in Maryland. And I wonder if what Judith Beckstein heard had to do with the Wallace shooting, because she named that name in her book along with the other assassinations, and believed that this institution, CIA prison, mental place for incarceration of people, in quotes, with mental diseases, and some we know just from the case of Dr. Frank Olson had no mental disease before they were to be shipped there. Was this in any way linked to the George Wallace shooting? Were they on the telephone talking about Arthur Bremer, who's in Maryland? Before I go into length about Dr. Frank Olson, because I've been doing research and cross-filing my articles for the last 3 days on that subject, I did think that people that listen to this show should write a letter to Representative Michael Harrington, Democrat of Massachusetts, who's taken one of the most heroic stands that any member of Congress has taken that I can think of. It's similar to what Daniel Ellsberg did with the Pentagon Papers. He asked himself, should a congressman cover up when the government is lying about criminal acts? Should he obey the law, obey the pledge made to his constituents, or should he continue to conceal crimes done by the Central Intelligence Agency? And there's a lot of reprimands going on because Harrington took the position of telling the truth. This is what the Nuremberg trial is about. I think that people that listen to this show could write to those who are trying to crucify Representative Michael Harrington and defend his position, write to the president, and write to him. He's in the House of Representatives, Washington, D.C., and if you appreciate the stand he took in revealing the illegal acts that the Central Intelligence Agency did against Chile and put his reputation and life on the line in speaking up, write to him and give him the support. I know myself that when I take a stand on a position and stick my neck out, I appreciate letters that support what I do, that people appreciate the risks you take. And it means a lot. If you just get 1 or 2 letters a week like that, it gives you the energy to keep what you're doing because those people know that you are taking this stand. It's an unpopular stand in Congress. It's an unpopular stand in your community, even with your coworkers. And I know what it means, and you should write to Representative Michael J. Harrington if you do appreciate the fact that he refused to hide criminals in the Central Intelligence Agency. The testimony of Mr. Colby was in direct opposition to the documents that existed. He had signed a pledge he would protect Mr. Colby and the CIA, and he broke the pledge because his obligation wasn't to Mr. Colby or the Central Intelligence Agency. His responsibility was to us, and for that, he should get thanks. Also, before I get on to Dr. Olson, there were two other matters. One was an article of this morning's paper on the 21st of July about the FBI doing break-ins. It's called Black Bag Burglars. It isn't a news story for those who have done research. William Turner, a former FBI man living up in the Bay Area, has written many books, one on the FBI. He does work in the political assassination of John Kennedy. He used to do black bag burglaries for the FBI. Now the FBI is admitting that they did 1,500 break-ins of embassies, missions, gangster hideouts, headquarters of extremists, the Communist Party, that they broke into various agencies, Czechoslovakian agency, the Russian, different countries didn't have the privacy. In our country, we said that democracy protected them. But they describe these black bag boys as FBI agents, if you can visualize it, in suits and ties who don't carry guns or badges or credentials. And the orders are, if you get caught, there's this disavowal, you're on your own. In other words, the agency says, we don't know who you are, you're not related to us. That was part of the job. One FBI man was a locksmith, one was a lookout man, and one or two did the ransacking. But the part that I think was important was that one of them was the slugger. If you can visualize the FBI in the role of slugger with their blue suits and polished shoes and ties, and they're standing in the hall, and they slug a man coming down the hall, knock him out evidently, to detract from what they're doing for somebody either coming to their own office or innocently coming down. The FBI's in the position of hiring sluggers on the black bag operation. There's sluggers in our society that are put into prison for knocking somebody down for the same thing or getting their paroles revoked, but the FBI can slug and rob and use it for blackmail. It doesn't mean that they will have arrests or protect us, but they're playing all kinds of games that we hardly can keep up with. Some of them even pose as garbage collectors. I was told by a private investigator I went to in '67 when I came home from New Orleans to burn my typewriter ribbons and burn my paper garbage because the agencies, the FBI and CIA, collect everything. So I put them in my fireplace, and I don't put them out in the trash. I just burned a typewriter ribbon this week. They can reconstruct everything I've written in the last month by taking that ribbon, and they do take the ribbon. And now it comes out, admittedly, that they are garbage collectors and that they do ransack offices, embassies, homes, organizations. Another matter which I will be talking at length maybe next week on Dialogue Conspiracy has to do with a man named Carlos that he's being searched for around the world in various countries. He is allegedly a terrorist, and his picture was in Newsweek this week, July 21st, 1975. The code name he has is Carlos. He has passports from many countries, and Carlos allegedly links the violence of Ireland to Germany to Japan, Yugoslavia, Turkey, Lebanon, France, Spain, and Uruguay, and Canada. And even an article said the United States. I have reason to believe that Carlos was going to be arrested, but the person that led him to Carlos, who was also murdered, was doing it because he was not a genuine terrorist. Carlos will link to the bringing of weapons into the airport in London last year, to the shooting of a gentleman named Mr. Marks. It will link to the CIA in Santa Barbara, to Travis Air Force Base that I mentioned before. And I have alleged for a long time that the right wing, the CIA, and the Stasi organization has been causing violence all over the world and trying to blame the legitimate third world persons for all of this violence. And I want you, those who are interested in following my line of reasoning and conspiracy, to save as many articles as come out about this particular gentleman. The story was that a friend of his, a Lebanese, was interrogated by the police and led the Paris police to the apartment where Carlos lives. Michael Makurabel is his name. And Makurabel and the two French police were killed. and Carlos has fled. He has 2 American passports. He has passports to many countries. And there's an article coming out from Beirut that the man who led the police to the apartment knew that he would die, that it was a suicide mission, and that he was a genuine terrorist, and felt that this Carlos, the suggestion is that Carlos came from a wealthy Venezuelan well-to-do family who moved in, quotes, mysterious ways, and that he was being killed because he was trying to link these other legitimate terrorists to lots of violence that's going on. In KLRB, just before I went on the news, there was a news report of evidence from Grove Press that the police department in New York City used the anti-Castro Cubans to do bombing in New York City. That's exactly the kind of terrorism. They blame the Puerto Ricans, they blame the blacks, or particularly the Puerto Ricans back there for these bombings, or the American terrorists, or the Weather Underground, and you'll find that a lot of this violence is done by the extreme right wing, funded by the CIA and FBI in America. And this is the story of, I believe that the searching for Mr. Carlos is very important, and if it's as important as I think it is, he will be killed just like Lee Harvey Oswald was, and we'll never get the true story. When they find him, they'll have to kill him. But the traces that he's leaving linked to what I called CIA international Stasi terrorism and not legitimate third world terrorism. Well, we're going to talk about LSD today. I want to talk about that LSD and give some quotations from the newspapers I'm receiving and information, putting it together for you as best I can in this short time period. Dr. Walter Weintraub said in the Washington Post this week, July 17th, that he was a member of the LSD Medical School Research Group. And he said an ordinary dose of the drug that you purchase on the street would have around 100 micrograms. But on the test, the subjects that were tested for short-term reaction, they gave 1,600 micrograms of LSD. It was 1,600 times stronger than the normal dose that the average person would be administering or taking. And this was given to people who didn't know that it was given to them. And Dr. Weintraub said that some of these people had a short-term reaction. Some were frightened for several hours. And then he said there were a few who had delusions of conspiracy against them. How could it be a delusion of a conspiracy when you're given 1,600 micrograms of LSD as an experimentation and it slipped in your food and you don't even know you had it? How that is an outright conspiracy, and then the person who's the victim is accused of having the delusion of a conspiracy. The secret testing of LSD on unsuspecting subjects on the West Coast began in 1955. One article said it began in the East in 1961, but that had to be the civilian population because the military started in 53. But I marked the West Coast beginning because I live on the West Coast. I was very much a part of the Haight-Ashbury scene coming down from San Francisco to Carmel to Big Sur. I mingled and knew among the hippie community as much as I could. My children were the age of these people coming through, and I know that the original grass, the original LSD, the rock concerts, the pop concerts were not contaminated by acid. People's stomachs weren't burned out. Monterey Pop in '67 was a tremendous success. It was such a good success that 7 musicians had to die within a few years afterwards. But then up at the Haight-Ashbury, this acid came that burned people out, drove them crazy, drove them berserk. There were suicides, irrational acts, and then the parents were told, see, your child dropped out, he's acting irrationally. It began on the West Coast in 55, but in 67 and even up to the present, if they've stopped putting the poison in LSD, they put it in heroin. The new rock musicians are dying from these sniffings of heroin with chemicals in them and arsenic. Several musicians just in the last couple of months, and what they call overdoses or suicides. We have to re-examine again whether they're murders or suicides and who is putting the strong stuff into LSD. So on the show today, when I talk about LSD, we're not talking about 100 micrograms. We're talking about 1,600 or more. Just like when they say one person's in the Commerce Department, they mean one or more. They don't deny there's more. They say there's one CIA in the Commerce Department. Now, the motives for the CIA using the LSD was that they may give it to diplomats operating abroad, or they may give it to our agents, so we have to test their reaction. They tested the potential effects of the CIA, but why did they give such heavy doses? Allegedly, it was defensive in nature, but according to the sources coming out, it was offensive as well. It could temporarily incapacitate, not necessarily kill. Well, the CIA wouldn't kill you if they gave you a strong dose. They give you the privilege of killing yourself. Whichever way you splice it or put it together, when you're stuck with heavy doses, you're not going to be very safe no matter where you are. Your car could go off the road. You could do irrational things, jump out of buildings. If you're making this stuff and handing it out, the CIA isn't making you kill somebody, but your car can go into somebody, and you might have just taken it that evening. They also admitted in the early 50s that they wanted to modify perception, thought, and emotional behavior. The CIA drug testing has continued since Dr. Olson's death. They've admitted that. They've been giving it on unsuspecting citizens since 55. They've admitted that. These are things I've been alleging for a long time. They started giving it to an employee of the Army, Dr. Olson, in 53. David Bellin from the Rockefeller Committee said, I think that there was knowledge of the existence of experimentation beyond those who are actually administering the drug. In other words, there were people behind it besides the 7 men that sat with Dr. Frank Olson, and one of those men gave it to him. The Bellin of the Rockefeller Committee has admitted it. The CIA contact for Dr. Frank Olson was Mr. Gottlieb and Dr. Lashbrook, and allegedly Dr. Gottlieb hasn't been seen around since. He hasn't surfaced now. I don't know if he was murdered or committed suicide or took the acid, but Dr. Olson's wife said that these 2 men disappeared from her life, that they were the CIA contact to the military with her husband, and they have disappeared from the scene. Lieutenant Colonel Ruwet, R-U-W-E-T, was one of Mr. Olson's colleagues, and he was present when Dr. Olson took this LSD, and he's the man who told the family the experience. He didn't say that he was given LSD and therefore went out the window, but he told them about the condition of being in the service of his country and threatened the CIA that if they didn't put his wife on a pension, that he would tell them what happened. And in that form of blackmail and conscience, Lieutenant Colonel Ruwet saw that Nancy Olson and her 3 children were put on a military pension and that he died in the line of duty. The story of Dr. Olson taking LSD broke in the Rockefeller report, and they never used his name. They said an agent of the U.S. Army working with the CIA jumped out of a window in New York City. Prior to this demise, he was warm, playful, easygoing man. He had a top security clearance at Fort Detrick, Maryland. He was one of the top researchers in germ warfare. And in the fall of 53, they were working on a special project, and they went to a compound in Maryland, and that's where his problems began. The work he was doing was the Special Operations Division of Fort Detrick, 50 top bacteriologists and biochemists. They worked in secrecy, and they met in private to discuss their progress. Dr. Olson went away for the week. He came home. He was despondent. He was a different person. His wife didn't know what happened, and something went terribly wrong. He came home and said to her, I made a terrible mistake. Now, the mistake he might have made wasn't that he took the LSD. It may be that he wanted to get out of the Army, because the minutes of the Rockefeller Committee meetings, their discussions of this thing, suggest that Dr. Olson wanted to back down from giving these tests to unsuspecting people. And this is an important question of wondering whether he was murdered because he was going to back down on the project. But he went home after a week with the CIA and the discussion of these pills of LSD for experimentation, and he said he made a mistake and he wanted to quit his job. This was the weekend. He was away Monday through Friday. Saturday and Sunday he was brooding. His personality was changed. Up till then he was one of the top officials, top chemists of the Operations Division, Special Operations Division. And Monday he went to work, and they reassured him to stay to work, not to quit. He came home in better spirits that evening, and on Tuesday morning, Colonel Ruwet, the contact of the Army to the CIA, told him that he needed a psychiatrist. That's because he went Monday and said he wanted to quit his job. So they said he needed psychiatric attention, and he told his wife he was going to New York for health. And this was after spending 1 week with the scientists. They had after dinner drinks. There's a list of people who attended the meeting. There was Dr. Frank Olson, Lieutenant Colonel Ruwet, a Dr. Schwab, a Dr. Stubbs, a Dr. Tanner, who's now dead, and a Ben Wilson. And then there were the CIA contacts, a Mr. Hughes, Huges, and a Mr. Bortner, Dr. Gottlieb, and a Dr. Lashbrook. Now, he went home, said he made a mistake about the job. He went to work on the job Monday. They came to him Monday night and said, "You're going to New York to a psychiatrist." The man who signed the original memo of the meeting of Dr. Olson, where the people who attended were listed, it was signed by the name Mal, M-A-L, John Malinowski. And the Olson family believes that he was present at the meeting where Dr. Olson got the LSD, but he was not given LSD. And John Malinowski is dead. There's already a list of deaths related to this episode, and hopefully this will begin to unwind. As I say, they're out at Deep Creek Lake, and the cover story for the men, they were to camouflage their cars, take off their bumper stickers that said Camp Dietrich, and the excuse to be there that they were editors, authors, lecturers, and sports writers meeting for a conference. And that was the cover story for the conference where these scientists, mad scientists, were to talk about this heavy LSD and slip it into the drinks of one of the members of their own group. Now, one of the people who attended this, Dr. Schwab, says he didn't have any part of the meeting. He said, at this type of meeting, you have sub-meetings in different parts of the place where the gathering is held. 7 people were at the conference. Dr. Harold Abramson was the person that Dr. Frank Olson was to see in New York City. He was picked up at his home. He worked for the Army, a scientist, accepted, no emotional problems, no psychiatrist, spends 5 days with the Army and the CIA, comes home and says he wants to quit. He goes to work and says, "I'm going to quit." They pick him up at his home and say, "No, you're going to a psychiatrist in New York." Now, they take him to Dr. Harold Alexander Abramson, who the newspaper says may have been working for the CIA. He had a high-ranking security clearance. He worked for the government on many top-secret jobs. He worked for pharmaceutical concerns, and he was described in 1959 at a meeting, a scientific meeting, in quotes, as sort of a psychiatric Dracula, because he was into LSD, and he was telling him his plans, but he didn't even tell them at that meeting. He had a patient who jumped out of a window or went out a window in New York City. This was 7 years later. He has a scientific paper on LSD and doesn't report what happened to Mr. Olson, even as patient X, like Thomas R., the Thomas Keeley case. He doesn't talk about Mr. X. He's an authority on LSD, and they call him the psychiatric Dracula. Now, Dr. Abramson suggests to Mr. Olson, Dr. Olson, I keep forgetting, that he should go to Chestnut Lodge in Maryland. And this is where the little plot got thicker in my head, because this is where the California authorities in Los Angeles were to ship my son to Chestnut Lodge, and he had had an acid, the same kind of LSD, and showed the same symptoms. Dr. Abramson did suggest that you can get violent reactions under LSD, that large doses should be given only if you're nearby a hospital. He talks at a psychiatric meeting and doesn't tell them that people have been suicidal on these doses. He's been used as a psychological consultant for the United States Department of Army, and Olson, after seeing him for 2 days, went back to Washington. We'll go into that in a minute, and then goes back to New York City and sees him again for a lot of consultation, extensive for a whole day, and jumps out of a 10th floor window that evening. Dr. Frank Olson, in quotes, committed suicide in 1953. And as I say, Dr. Abramson never mentioned at a convention as late as 1959 that his patient had jumped out of a window. Dr. Abramson studies in New York City. He studied medicine at Columbia University, which is also funded by the Central Intelligence Agency, large amounts of money and agents. He's authored 200 professional publications. He was sponsored with LSD research by the Josiah Macy Jr. Foundation in the 50s. He's now practicing in Manhattan and Long Island, consultant research psychiatrist, State Hospital and Central Islip, director of research at South Oak Psychiatric Hospital in Amityville. I'm giving those names so that people in the East want to look them up or follow this up, they can. Now, Dr. Frank Olson visited Dr. Abramson. He was carried by a member of the military. Colonel Rouet took him up there. He took them for the first visit. He took him, and they had several sessions. They spent the whole day. And Dr. Abramson wrote down on the medical record that Dr. Olson was suffering from delusions and severe psychosis. Now, this was a man who 7 days later was working, who carried on a job, who worked with the top secret enclave inside of another enclave in the most secret halls of the CIA and Army, and yet 7 days later he's diagnosed by a CIA doctor with delusions and severe psychosis. The diagnosis should have been he's suffering from an ingestion of a foreign object or pill, whatever you want to call it, and treated him as a victim of an LSD misbehavior on the part of his coworkers, but instead the burden of proof was on the Olson family that this man was a severe psychotic, and this is what they did in my family, and they've done with many other people too, given the illusion or hoping that the burden of proof and the illness is in the person's head and wasn't ingested and handed to them by specific persons with government contacts and government contracts. Now, Olson went home. He saw Dr. Abramson for 2 days. He returned to Washington. He was evidently there a short time, enough to get on a telephone, called his wife and family. It was Thanksgiving weekend, but he lost control of this Colonel Rouet and a Mr. Lashbrook of the CIA accompanying back to New York City. And he didn't go back alone. The agent of the CIA took him back to New York City, so he never saw his family again. When he got back to New York City that same night, he came home. He wanted to quit his job. He wanted to come home, and he lost his Army officer and picked up his CIA officer, Mr. Lashbrook, lost the colonel and picked up the CIA, and was taken back to New York City the same night, where he called his wife, and he was with his agent of the CIA. He talked about his homecoming, and he told his wife on the telephone that he was entering a hospital. She said it wasn't a farewell call, and it wasn't anything like that. Now, a man who is in the military, in CIA, who works with Bethesda Hospital, must have known what Chestnut Lodge was. He must have been terrified if they used cases for brain experimentation, and he must have known that he wasn't irrational 7 days later. And he calls his wife and says, they're putting me in the sanitarium, which is what my own son did. He called me, but I was able to stop his going there. And he never ended up in Chestnut Lodge. But Mr. Olson, Frank Olson, doctor, may have been terrorized the same way a member of my family was. Now, again, Dr. Abramson wrote down on the medical record he's suffering from a severe psychosis and delusions, and that diagnosis was made before his death. And that evening, after he called his wife, he plunged from the 10th floor of the Statler Hotel in mid-Manhattan. In New York, he had been going for 4 days for psychiatric treatment. As I say, when he was supposed to go into Chestnut Lodge, he was with a CIA agent by the name of Ashbrook. He was with Dr. Abramson, who has high-ranking security clearance. The 2 CIA officials were in charge of this man. The CIA took him to this retreat in Maryland, and there would be no way to develop this psychosis or delusions on his own except from the LSD, and there was no mention in his medical record that he had ever suffered. He never had any psychiatric help before. So what they were going to do, because they had given him this pill that week earlier, this LSD, to put him into the CIA sanitarium instead of an honest diagnosis. And this poses the question of how many people we have to go back and forward on other research programs and say how many people jump out of windows, how many people like Mary Jo Kopechne can have a drink at Chappaquiddick and be asleep in a car and not awake enough, still breathing, but not awake enough to get out of the car when it's overturned in 8 feet of water. How many people crashed, witnesses to the John Kennedy assassination, were in car crashes, went through plate glass windows, cut their throats, ate cyanide. How many people actually commit suicide of these 100 people related to the John Kennedy assassination or other witnesses? How many had control of their own bodies or the wheel, or how many were given something that caused them to go berserk? If a man as sophisticated as Dr. Olson can take something in his mouth and not taste it or know it, and has to be told he took it, how many other witnesses can take things and be injected not through the arm or not through any more subtle way than something in an after-dinner drink? Now, the police report of Dr. Olson's death was written by James Ward. This is the way it was written up. It said he came to New York in November 24, 53 with Colonel Vincent Rouet. They stayed at the Statler Hotel. He was examined twice by Dr. Abramson, a physician whose office was on 58th Street. And it didn't go on to say that. It said he was examined twice, but it didn't say his mental condition or the diagnosis. It said Mr. Olson and Colonel Rouet returned to Washington the morning of the 26th. The same afternoon, Mr. Olson returned to New York, accompanied this time by a man who identified himself as Robert Lashbrook, a consultant chemist who worked for the Defense Bureau of the War Department. Now, he was taken by a CIA agent. It wasn't the Defense Department at all. They changed controls, and this man, Mr. Lashbrook, Dr. Lashbrook of the CIA, was the one who was with him at the time that he died. The autopsy report stated cause of death, multiple fractures. How many people, important witnesses to cases, have jumped out of windows? I'll go through my file that I have on Murderville. Important people in New York City that have jumped out of windows, allegedly suicides. Were they in control of their own bodies? These important witnesses to organized crime, to ITT, to the political assassination, civil rights leaders, public officials that have died from these weird accidents. The autopsy report said that the cause of death was multiple fractures. But then it went on to say, due to the important position held by the deceased and Lashbrook with the U.S. government, the facts of the case were related to an FBI agent by the name of George Dalen by telephone, not in writing, George Dalen by telephone. Now, Dominic DeMeo was acting chief medical examiner. He's asked to open this case, and this case is important again when we think in terms of these mysterious deaths we're talking about, these murders, because I have reason to believe, number one, that sitting in that room with those 7 people, that Dr. Olson may have not wanted to give this strong acid to test civilian population, to test soldiers, because later it turned out they gave it to 500 here, 1,500 there, different military bases, and I allege that they're still, when the tests are over, they're still doing it. They stopped the tests in 67, but now you're getting the result of the test. The minutes of the meeting aren't clear that he didn't balk, because the minutes suggest that he balked at the idea or wasn't for it. And then the next day, he was the one who got the dose. And then he was taken when he wanted to quit his job. He was the one that was taken to New York. And when he came back home, he called his wife and was taken away into stronger control by the CIA. And we don't know if maybe he was running out of that hotel room to get to his family. My own son walked out of Langley Porter, where he was confined, and called me from Santa Cruz and didn't want any testing, any Thorazine, any diagnosis, because he knew he had taken LSD that was poison. He knew he wasn't a schizophrenic or that he had any of the problems that the doctors gave the diagnosis for before he took the LSD. At the time, he had a contract working for Bobby Darin, writing songs, getting $150 a week, going to UC Santa Cruz. So getting back to the medical examiner there, where they say the multiple fractures are suicidal, when the CIA doesn't tell the truth, when they conceal these things, it affects people across the board around the country. Dr. Olson's family isn't the only family affected. Mine isn't the only one. 500 here, 1,500 there, and that's all they're admitting to. But as time goes on, it'll go clearer. But the chief medical examiner has asked to reopen the case because he says there were 4 big things that were left out at the time of the death. Number one, Lashbrook never mentioned that LSD was given. I had the same trouble in my own particular case where the doctor refused to accept the evidence that LSD was given. In my case, it was refused given in that case and in other cases. I'm just saying from my own personal experience. And from Mr. Lashbrook's, Dr. Lashbrook, they never said LSD was given. They said they were paranoid schizophrenics with delusions. How many delusions can you have when people are poisoning you and locking you up and keeping you from your family and railroading you? Number 2, he said there was a discrepancy in the death report because the first report was, Dr. Lashbrook said that he gave a report that Mr. Olson went out the window at 1:30 a.m., that he woke up and saw him running out, and then from the bedroom, that they both woke at the same time. They're evidently in the same room at the Statler Hotel on the 10th floor. And he saw him leap through the shade and leap through the window and fell out. And the other report is that he was asleep and heard the plate glass break at 3:30 in the morning and called downstairs to the hotel office, and they said, yes, he had killed himself. And I posed the question, knowing from the experience in my own family of a member being trapped and locked up, and luckily having a dime to avoid this same kind of mental experimentation and further imprisonment at a CIA hospital? Was he waiting till Dr. Lashbrook was asleep and running down the hall to get out of the place? We're never going to know whether he had help going out that window and the hotel door was locked, or whether he was trying to get out the door. Because when you get multiple fractures from the 10th floor, you can't tell if somebody pushed you or not. The fall, it breaks your body, and it would be impossible to tell which way. If he were shot first, it would be different. If he had help first, we wouldn't know. When he called his wife that he had to go in the sanitarium, was just like he wanted to quit his job. He was sane enough to want to quit his job after the LSD, and LSD only lasts 24 hours, allegedly. The effects of this strong stuff last more. But was he trying to get out the hotel door and was pushed out, given help? I'm not charging Dr. Lashberg. I'm not letting him off. I'm asking the question, how would we know when he's faced with Chestnut Lodge? All I had to do is pick up a phone and talk to the colonel and the admiral and do a little bit of inquiry and find out that the doctor that was sending my son there never had a patient there before, and that the drug was administered coincidentally the weekend that I'm in New Orleans working with Jim Garrison, who is alleged that Clay Shaw is a member of the CIA and David Ferry was a member of the CIA, and they were part of the Kennedy assassination. So the same weekend that I'm accusing the CIA, just coincidentally, this thing is taking place in my home while I'm in New Orleans. And the end result is Chestnut Lodge, Dr. Olson, or whatever. That was the dumping point of a lot of people and the front for a military hospital. The other discrepancies besides the time he woke up is that Dr. Lashbrook didn't tell the medical examiner that this particular person, Olson, was under the care of a psychiatrist. He said he was examined twice by a physician. He didn't tell him he was under the care of a psychiatrist, which makes a big difference because this psychiatrist, who works for the CIA and had government security clearance, knew that the man had LSD and falsified the records that he had a mental disease. That psychiatrist would have locked him up if he was a danger. He would have put him in an institution. He wouldn't have been on the 10th floor of the Statler Hotel with another man from the Central Intelligence Agency. He would have committed him right then to Chestnut Lodge. He wouldn't have let him on the 10th floor. So I think Dr. Olson was ready to tell something or break about the testing of LSD in 53. We wouldn't have believed him. No one would have believed him if he had said it. They should have let him out to talk because no one would have believed it. And the fourth discrepancy in this death report was they didn't give the name of the physician. He was under the care of a physician. They didn't give the name of the physician. They said he was with a chemist, which was another lie. There were 5 lies here. A news report said there were 4. The medical examiner said there were 4. But he didn't say he was under the care of the Central Intelligence Agency. But the official report, 4 big things were missing. And the question is, how depressed was he? If he knew what Chestnut Lodge was, if he knew that he wanted to quit his job, if he called his wife and he was fleeing out of that bed, what proof is there that he was going for the window and not the door? And I keep repeating it because in these famous leaps out the windows, and we'll pull them out the files, we'll bring up the same question. The medical examiner, as I say, wants to reopen the case. Nobody revealed to them that Olson was given LSD. Nobody revealed the effects of LSD. And Dr. Abramson was an expert on it. He'd been studying it for several years. He was one of the first people working on the tests of it. Nobody said that he was sent to a psychiatrist who was an expert on LSD, who had a high-ranking security clearance and worked for the CIA. Now, there is a woman named Judith Beck Stein. I mentioned her earlier in this show. She wrote a book called The True Story of a Victim of the American Psychiatric Prison System. It's called The Journal of Judith Beck Stein. It cost $2.40, the Columbia Journal, Washington, D.C. It came out in 1973. If I read it too fast, write to me a self-addressed envelope, and I'll send you the name. Judith is a writer, a newspaper reporter, a graduate of Vassar College. She worked at Medill School of Journalism in Northwestern Illinois, the mother of 2 sons. She said she was the target of attempted murder, blackmail, character assassination, terror tactics, psychological manipulations. She was incarcerated at Chestnut Lodge for purely political reasons, and she claimed that she was put there because she was working in the 1960s in civil rights movement. She believed that blacks should have equal rights with whites. She was for integration in all of its aspects. She made a mistake of being married to one of the upper class, her family oil interests, amounted to about $18 million when they sold to Standard Oil. She said she was a young idealist born with a lifelong social conscience, and the thanks she got for her social conscience was a glass of champagne, in which she took some champagne that was brought home by a friend that her husband had given her, maybe innocently or not, at which point she became completely out of it. She was supporting the New Frontier, the Kennedy administration, Adlai Stevenson. She got a bottle of champagne as a gift. She took it. She said she was taken to Michael Reese Hospital in Chicago and sent immediately to Chestnut Lodge. And she claims this place is for testing human beings, and the motives for mind experimentation is to create a super race of Nordic whites, that they're racist there, the doctors are racist, and they take people with a conscience from the wealthy upper class, which would go into my son or hurting him because of the work I'm doing, and they railroaded her to this institution called Chestnut Lodge. She said the doctor in charge of her case was 22 and a half years, chief of Navy psychiatry. She said it was a fascist conspiracy against her. She says his name is Dr. Samuel V. Thompson, and that he was put on her case. In her book, she makes a point about a book called I Never Promised You a Rose Garden that was published in 1963. She said it was written by a, in quote, cured inmate to cover the Chestnut Lodge work, the CIA experimental prison and dirty trick unit. She said the book was a front put out to take a few people as a front, and that it is a place that does experimental work in reality. Now, I'm reading from her book. She says Chestnut Lodge is a private psychiatric hospital dealing with schizophrenics and other victims of mental illnesses. That is their cover. It is a private psychiatric hospital. In reality, Chestnut Lodge appears to be a profit-making research prison whose staff members combine a small private practice with research work in the military, for the Central Intelligence Agency, for the National Institute of Mental Health in Bethesda, Maryland, for the Food and Drug Administration. She said Alan Dulles had his own son confined in Chestnut Lodge, and CIA personnel were assigned to nurse him around the clock. The administration is run by a retired Army colonel who succeeded a full-fledged naval personnel. In the letter I wrote to them in April 1970, I get a message: the cost for incarcerating or imprisoning my own son would be $2,700 a month, and it would be paid to Colonel Lewis McCollar, the controller. Samuel Vincent Thompson was the doctor assigned to her, and the new evidence coming about the CIA experimentations on unknowing persons, links to Bethesda Psychiatric Institute, and she mentions the doctor from the former chief of Bethesda who works with the CIA. The comparisons to Judith Beckstein's story and Dr. Frank Olson's are too numerous to put on this one program. Now, she had a guardian or conservator appointed for her. A guardian and conservator in Los Angeles was appointed for my son, and Dr. Olson never got there. They tied up their money. They wanted to do psychosurgery on her. She said they wanted to silence her voice, and her typewriter because of her belief in integration and one world and people making it with other colors, black and white. And she was very active in the civil rights movement as a very wealthy and educated person from Vassar, and that was a no-no in her own group and among other people. She says she heard certain doctors like Dr. Thompson and Roy Grinker talk about black problems, and they would let her out if she got disinvolved in human relations or pro-integration activities, including civil rights. She heard them talk about solutions for the black problem in Chestnut Lodge, and she realized that they were there to extinguish fires, which meant put the lid on people writing about civil rights. She said this institution is one of the dirty trick psychiatric safe houses of the CIA, interchanged with Army and Navy. It is private, but is government controlled for their experiments and their political prison. It was in 1972, as I said, that she caught her Navy doctor in a telephone conversation with persons connected with the state's attorney office in Maryland, and that conversation convinced her that the place was somehow involved in all the political assassinations and murders and related violence of the last 10 years. And whatever they were saying there, this doctor, the retired Navy captain, who she says hides behind classified deeds, George Wallace was arrested in Maryland. Arthur Brammer was arrested in Maryland. he has this silly grin as if he's programmed or doesn't know what is happening. Bremer still grinning and not talking. Were the Navy doctors behind? Did they program him before or after he was funded at the Waldorf Astoria? What did she hear? What did Judith Beckstein hear at that particular place? She wrote a book in 73 because she linked Watergate to this mental institution, and the people there were very instrumental political assassinations. And I have talked on her book before on Dialogue Conspiracy, but some of you haven't heard it. But there are links between the CIA, the political assassinations, specific doctors, Navy intelligence, and it will be coming out for maybe years to come in the news, the use of mind control and behavior mod in these things. But do save articles on Dr. Frank Olson that come out and the lawsuit that follows, and hope that more of it comes out so that we can relate mind control to the political assassinations. Well, that's it for this week. I went fast because I had so much material to bring in. We couldn't cover it anyway. We'll see you next week on Dialogue Conspiracy.
This has been Dialogue Conspiracy with political research specialist Mae Brussell, who for 10 years has been researching the facts behind political assassinations and conspiracies in this country. Dialogue Conspiracy originates with KLRB FM in Carmel, California.